Nuclear weapons can seriously compete with the internet and antibiotics for the title of the most important invention in human history. It is almost impossible to find scientists who deny that atomic bombs have caused a sharp decrease in the number of global conflicts since the middle of the last century. There are certainly many wars on the planet, but in terms of human history, nothing has changed. Unfortunately, there have always been wars and probably always will be. Nuclear weapons have only reduced the number of wars on a huge scale because everyone realizes that battles with mutual destruction are pointless. But will there be mutual elimination? Is it not a historical myth? Is nuclear winter real? That's what we're going to talk about in the next couple minutes as we learn more about nuclear weapons. Our first stop, of course, will be Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the terrible and fortunately only disasters involving nuclear weapons. They are the easiest to use as a supporting example. An example that will immediately lead to the first myth about atomic bombs. It lies in their supposedly insane lethality, which caused Japan's instant surrender. This is not true at all, for Tokyo suffered almost the same devastation without nuclear weapons. On March 10th in 1945, 334 US B-29 bombers destroyed 40% of the city's housing stock in a single day. That's about as much as the atomic bomb destroyed in Nagasaki. And in terms of victims, the situation is similar. In a single day of bombing in Tokyo, 80,000 people were killed, according to the most conservative estimates. The reality is that, from the point of view of World War II, there was little difference between atomic weapons and classical bombing. On February 13th, 1945, about 100,000 people died as a result of the Allied raid on Dresden, and we are not even touching chemical weapons. They can easily compete with nuclear weapons. In 1935 to 1936, from Italian chemical attacks, 275,000 Ethiopians died. The number of victims of bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki could not compare not only with the main, but even with ordinary battles of the Second World War. For a couple of weeks, Bialystok from the Battle of Camino, only the USSR lost 341,000 people, and atomic bombing losses are a far cry from what made Japan surrender. They lost far more people from conventional bombing and capitulated because of the USSR's entry into the war. This is what Emperor Hirohito cited as the main reason in his statement on August 17, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not mentioned in the paper at all. Well, as for the subsequent events, the fact that nobody really knew how many atomic weapons the USA had and was not aware of the real scale of destruction played its role in fostering fear of atomic weapons. They are, by the way, the second myth about atomic weapons. It consists in the fact that the bombing allegedly wipes out entire cities from the face of the earth, making the space uninhabitable. In reality, again, this is not quite the case. In an air blast with the power of a megaton, the zone of complete destruction is less than 3 miles, the average destruction, about 4.4. And at a distance of 6 miles, only 5% of the population will die. And that's talking about a classic modern bomb. On Hiroshima and Nagasaki dropped 10 times weaker. The main striking factor in Hiroshima was fire, because the building was typically Japanese, wooden and cardboard. The geographical location also played its role, because in hilly Nagasaki, the fire tornado did not occur, and most of the brick buildings continued to stand. In other words, atomic bombs are scary, but they do not turn huge cities into dust. One could say that this is not a problem, because since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear capabilities of countries have increased many times over, and mankind can pelt each other with bombs. This is also a myth, because nuclear weapons are insanely expensive. You can often find statements that the bombing of the same Tokyo in World War II was the result of thousands of people and munitions, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were defeated with just one bomb, and it is much cheaper to fight with nuclear weapons. That's not true at all. After all, the Manhattan Project budget in 1945 was 90% of the total small arms spending and almost 40% of the total spending on tanks. The two Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs cost as many as tens of thousands of tanks and airplanes and cost as much money as 9 out of 10 rifles produced in the United States. And that's just the bomb, which still has to be delivered. The budget for the creation of the B-29 bomber is even more than the atomic bomb, and is generally considered the most expensive project of World War II. Suppose you say that it is about development, and further production is easier. This is also a mistake, because the production of the atomic bomb is insanely expensive, and most importantly, it needs to be constantly maintained. For example, now the US is modernizing W-80 nuclear warheads, and each will require $75 million. According to calculations from a book by nuclear expert Stephen Schwartz, From 1940 to 1998, the US spent $5 trillion on its nuclear arsenal. By comparison, that's 25 of China's annual military budgets for 2021. In general, the language does not turn to call nuclear weapons cheap, and it is not out of the goodness of their hearts that the US and other countries are reducing their nuclear capabilities. If atomic weapons were so cheap and simple, these potentials would only increase. We are not so naive as to believe in humanism and the destruction of nuclear arsenals for the sake of humanity, are we? If you are still in doubt, the following myth will dispel your doubts. It lies in the simplicity and safety of atomic weapons. Allegedly, you can play soccer without a fuse and nothing will happen. This is partly true, but in life everything is much more complicated, and there are many incidents related to nuclear warheads in history.
This video is brought to you by Thorum. Take a look at this rings. They have rings made from 4 billion-year-old Gibeon meteorite and genuine 65 million-year-old T-Rex bone. If you are a fan of Vikings, they have Odin ring, the Norse god of war, the Thor ring, and all of them are crafted by hand. Head the link in the comments and use promo code LIVINGHISTORY to get 20% off a truly unique ring.
For example, the investigation of the National Interest Portal showed that at least 1,200 nuclear weapons of the USA in the period from 1950 to 1968 became the cause of dangerous incidents, and this means not spilled tea on the warhead. In 1980, a laborer in Arkansas dropped a wrench attachment into the shaft of a titanium-2 rocket. It punctured the rocket's first stage tank, causing a leak. Personnel were promptly evacuated, but at 3 a.m. September 19th, the rocket with a W-53 nuclear warhead exploded. The 740-ton shaft cover was blown off like a piece of fluff, and even though the warhead seemed to remain in order, the U.S. command was not relieved. So the next time you berate yourself for hands growing from the wrong place, remember the laborer with the wrench? There was another, no less dramatic story. On January 24th, 1961, a B-52 plane carried 2 thermonuclear bombs 260 times more powerful than those that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A fuel leak was discovered, which led to the destruction of the airplane and the death of the crew. The bombs detached from the airplanes according to instructions, except that the parachute opened on only one of the 2. Also, 3 of the 4 fuses were tripped, putting the bomb on alert. Only a low-voltage switch saved the U.S. from a disaster of unprecedented proportions. Well, the second bomb was scattered so that the plutonium charge and a pile of radioactive debris had to search for engineering troops. And now remember that there are more than 1,000 such incidents in 17 years alone. And the question of why countries reduce nuclear weapons will resolve itself. It is insanely expensive, dangerous, and fraught with unreal consequences. With that out of the way, let's move on to other myths. For example, about irretrievable radioactive contamination of the area. A small spoiler can be the fact that now Hiroshima and Nagasaki are quite inhabited. Well, if to be more detailed, the intensity of radiation in 7 hours after the explosion of a nuclear bomb drops 10 times. 49 hours later, 100 times, and after 343 hours, 1,000 times. Between 1945 and 1970, leukemia rates among Japanese bomb survivors doubled. That's scary, but still we're talking about no more than a percentage of the total. Moreover, during the year after the bombing, Hiroshima was controlled by 40,000 American soldiers. And at that time, they did not know about radiation sickness and walked in ordinary clothes. And yet no mass deaths were recorded. Again, let us once again recall the exceptionally wooden cities without specialized shelters. If they had been in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the casualty figures would have been very different. On Bikini Atoll, for example, the Americans tested a 15-megaton hydrogen bomb, and 4 years after the explosion, the biologists who arrived discovered something funny. Right in the crater of the explosion bloomed meteor corals, and the underwater ecosystem was completely restored. In general, it is not worth waiting for the Earth to turn into a nuclear desert, even if all atomic bombs explode at the same time. In short, the myth that nuclear war will split the Earth was invented during the Cold War. In reality, the ground explosion of an incredibly powerful 58-megaton munition similar to the Tsar Bomba creates a crater with a diameter of about 200 meters. There is even a very simple form that calculates the consequences of such explosions. To create an artificial Lake Chagán in 1965 even excavated a well 178 meters deep. And after the explosion, the crater still turned out to be about 100 meters deep. Splitting the balloon and piercing the Earth's crust is definitely not even a hypothetical option. It's something on the level of urban legends. The same can be said about the guaranteed 10-fold destruction of life on Earth when all nuclear weapons are detonated. The average yield of current warheads is somewhere around half a megaton. But even if you take a 5 megaton bomb, calculate its killing effect, and divide that by the total surface area of the Earth, you get somewhere around 70,000. Mankind doesn't have that many bombs of this class. There are only about 13,000 of them, and the vast majority of them are much weaker. Well, if people want to build that many warheads, they will run into the myths we talked about earlier. This would require gorillions of budgets, and the risks of accidents and incidents would be such that no one would go for it. So, to summarize, unfortunately or fortunately, nuclear weapons are not as scary as they are perceived by the masses. Recently declassified U.S. intelligence data states that, according to their calculations, countries are enough to have 100 warheads each to effectively maintain parity of forces and prevent World War III. Will mankind succeed? We'll live and see. Well, that's all for now. See you in the bunker, folks.